Modal realism stands as one of the most provocative philosophical positions of the 20th century. Championed by David Lewis, it makes an audacious claim about the nature of reality itself. The thesis states that all possible worlds are as real as our actual world. They are concrete physical universes that exist in the same way our universe exists. These worlds are not abstract ideas, linguistic constructs, or mathematical models. They are genuine, spatially extended, causally connected physical systems that populate reality. This position emerges from a straightforward attempt to solve technical problems in modal logic. Modal logic concerns necessity and possibility, asking what must be true versus what could be true. Lewis recognized that treating modal claims as quantifications over possible worlds provided unprecedented explanatory power. However, he insisted these worlds must be taken literally and concretely, not metaphorically. Most philosophers considered this claim absurd when Lewis first proposed it in the 1960s. The incredulous stare became the standard response to his position about infinite concrete universes. Yet Lewis defended modal realism vigorously until his death in 2001. His defense rested on showing how his theory solved otherwise intractable philosophical problems. Understanding modal realism requires grasping both its technical motivations and its metaphysical commitments. The view connects deeply to questions about causation, laws of nature, and counterfactual reasoning. It also intersects with debates about properties, propositions, and the fundamental structure of reality. Part 1. The Core Thesis. Modal realism consists of 5 interconnected doctrines that together define the position. First, possible worlds exist as genuine entities, not as fictions or useful abstractions. Lewis insisted that existence must be univocal, meaning there is only one sense of existence. Either something exists or it does not, with no intermediate metaphysical status available. Possible worlds exist in precisely the same sense that tables and electrons exist. This rejects views that treat possible worlds as abstract objects like numbers or sets. Second, possible worlds are concrete rather than abstract entities in the technical metaphysical sense. Concreteness means having spatio-temporal location and causal connections among parts. Abstract objects like numbers have no location and participate in no causal relations. Concrete objects occupy space, persist through time, and causally interact with other concrete entities. Each possible world is a maximally connected spatio-temporal region containing concrete physical objects. Stars, planets, organisms, and atoms populate these worlds just as they populate ours. The worlds contain genuine matter and energy governed by physical laws. They are not linguistic descriptions, sets of propositions, or mental constructs. Third, possible worlds are irreducible entities that cannot be analyzed into more basic components. This means we cannot define possible worlds using modal notions like necessity or possibility. Lewis sought a reductive analysis where modality gets explained by non-modal facts. If we defined possible worlds using modal terms, we would create circular explanations. The goal was translating modal statements into purely extensional language about what exists. Extensional language uses only truth-functional connectives and quantifiers over existing objects. Lewis wanted to eliminate primitive modal operators from our fundamental metaphysical picture. Instead, necessity means truth in all worlds, and possibility means truth in some world. This reduction only works if worlds themselves are non-modal, concrete, independent entities. Fourth, actuality is indexical, meaning the term actual functions like here or now. When I call my world actual, I simply indicate it is the world I inhabit, just as I can call my location here without claiming any metaphysical privilege for it. Every possible world is actual from the perspective of its own inhabitants. No world has special ontological status, making it more real than other worlds. The indexicality thesis has profound implications for understanding modal discourse and our epistemic position. It means our world has no privileged status in the totality of what exists. We use actual to pick out our world, but this reflects our perspective only. Inhabitants of other worlds would correctly call their worlds actual using the same indexical. This parallels how different people correctly call different times now or different places here. The indexicality of actuality dissolves certain puzzles about how we know modal truths. Fifth, possible worlds are spatiotemporally and causally isolated from one another completely. No causal influence can pass between worlds, and no spatiotemporal relations connect them. Two objects are worldmates if and only if they stand in spatiotemporal relations. Everything in a world connects through space and time to everything else there. The isolation thesis follows from understanding worlds as maximal spatiotemporal unities. If two regions were spatiotemporally connected, they would belong to one world necessarily. Lewis supplements these five doctrines with principles ensuring the plenitude of possible worlds. Plenitude means every genuine possibility corresponds to some world where that possibility obtains. The principle of recombination states that any arrangement of objects is possible. We can recombine duplicates of actual objects in any spatiotemporal configuration we choose. If something exists in our world, then duplicates exist in different arrangements elsewhere. This generates the vast multitude of worlds needed for a complete modal metaphysics. Recombination has limits, though, because Lewis respects certain constraints on possibility. Logical contradictions never correspond to genuine possibilities that some world realizes. Nothing can be both entirely red and entirely blue simultaneously at one location. No round squares inhabit any possible world because such descriptions are internally contradictory. However, Lewis distinguished logical impossibility from various forms of physical or nomological impossibility sharply. Physical laws of our world need not hold in all possible worlds. Worlds exist where electrons have different masses or where gravity operates inversely. The speed of light varies across worlds, and quantum mechanics takes different forms. Indeed, worlds exist with radically different physical laws, different fundamental particles, different forces. Lewis committed to naturalistic plenitude, meaning every naturally possible situation gets realized somewhere. Natural possibility encompasses far more than logical consistency requires or our laws permit. This commitment generates infinitely many worlds, exhibiting every possible variation on physical reality. Understanding why Lewis insisted on concrete rather than ersatz possible worlds illuminates his methodology. Ersatz realism treats possible worlds as abstract representations of ways things could be. These might be maximally consistent sets of propositions describing complete world states, or they might be properties the world could instantiate, or maximally specific states of affairs. Lewis rejected all ersatz theories because they covertly smuggle primitive modality back in. How do we determine which sets of propositions are maximally consistent without modal notions? Consistency itself seems to be a modal notion requiring appeal to possibility. Similarly, uninstantiated properties and obtaining states of affairs seem to require modal understanding. Lewis demanded genuinely non-modal truth conditions for modal statements to avoid circularity. Only concrete worlds provide such conditions because their existence involves no modal facts. Part 2. Historical Development and Intellectual Origins. The concept of possible worlds traces back to Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz in the 17th century. Leibniz developed possible worlds theory to address the theological problem of evil. He asked how an omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good God could create a world containing evil. Leibniz argued that God surveyed all logically possible worlds before creating anything. Each possible world represented a complete, consistent way reality could be arranged. God, being perfectly good, chose to actualize the best of all possible worlds. This world contains evil, but any world with less evil would lack compensating goods. The evils we observe are logically necessary for achieving the greatest overall good. Leibniz treated possible worlds as ideas existing in the divine mind before creation. They were abstract objects, not concrete physical universes existing independently of God. For Leibniz, possible substances divide into groups based on compossibility relations among them. Two substances are compossible if their joint existence involves no logical contradiction. Each maximal set of compossible substances constitutes one complete possible world. God's creative choice involved selecting which maximal compossible set to actualize. The principle of sufficient reason demanded that God have adequate reason for this choice. Only the superior perfection of one world over alternatives could justify actualizing it. Leibniz thus connected possible worlds theory directly to questions about divine rationality and justice. His framework allowed defining modal concepts in terms of truth across worlds. Necessity meant truth in all possible worlds, while contingency meant variation across worlds. This anticipated modern possible world semantics by nearly 300 years. However, Leibniz's possible worlds remained firmly rooted in theological and rationalist metaphysics. They existed only as contents of divine understanding, not as independent realities. The actual world possessed unique metaphysical status as the sole actualized possibility. Leibniz never suggested that non-actualized possibilities existed concretely anywhere. His view thus represented a form of what contemporary philosophers call Ersatzrealism. The leap from Leibnizian possible worlds to Lewisian modal realism required centuries of development. The crucial intermediate step came with the formalization of modal logic in 20th century. Clarence Irving Lewis, no relation to David Lewis, pioneered formal modal logic beginning in 1912. He developed axiomatic systems capturing different modal principles through varying inference rules. These systems allowed rigorous study of necessity, possibility, and related modal notions. The decisive breakthrough arrived in the 1950s and 60s with relational semantics. Saul Kripke and others developed model theoretic semantics for modal logic using possible worlds. In Kripke semantics, models contain sets of worlds connected by accessibility relations. A formula counts as necessarily true if true at all worlds accessible from the actual world. Different accessibility relations generate different modal logics with distinct provable theorems. This framework provided precise, mathematically rigorous interpretations of modal operators. Philosophers could now evaluate modal arguments using formal semantic methods. The success of possible world semantics created pressure to understand possible worlds metaphysically. Were these merely mathematical abstractions useful for logical purposes only? Or did possible world semantics reveal something deep about the structure of reality itself? David Kellogg. Lewis entered this debate with distinctive commitments shaped by his philosophical training. Born in 1941, Lewis studied under Willard Van Orman Quine at Harvard. Quine advocated strict naturalism, rejecting primitive modal notions as scientifically suspect. He famously criticized modal logic for creating referential opacity and other technical difficulties. Quine insisted on extensional logic, using only truth-functional connectives and ordinary quantifiers. Modal operators, like necessarily and possibly, seem to violate extensional clarity. Lewis absorbed Quine's methodological naturalism, but rejected his modal skepticism. He sought to vindicate modal discourse by reducing it to extensional quantification. If possible, worlds existed concretely, modal statements became ordinary existential claims about them. Saying something is possible means some concrete world contains an instance of it. Lewis's dissertation became his first book, Convention, published in 1969. It analyzed social conventions using game theory and decision theory. His second book, Counterfactuals, appeared in 1973 and proved enormously influential. Counterfactual conditionals state what would have been true under contrary-to-fact conditions. Lewis developed a formal semantics for counterfactuals using possible worlds and similarity relations. This work established him as a leading figure in philosophy of language and modal logic. Throughout the 1970s, Lewis refined his views on modality and possible worlds. He published papers on Counterpart Theory, addressing problems about identity across worlds. His 1968 paper on Counterpart Theory introduced the basic framework. It showed how to interpret modal claims without requiring trans-world identity for individuals. Lewis's magnum opus on the plurality of worlds appeared in 1986. This book presented his mature defense of modal realism in comprehensive detail. He acknowledged that his position contradicted common-sense intuitions about reality dramatically. Most people do not believe infinitely many concrete universes exist beyond our own. Lewis faced this objection directly, calling it the incredulous stare objection. He argued that theoretical benefits justified accepting counterintuitive ontological commitments. Scientists accept atoms, electrons, and curved space-time despite their counterintuitiveness. These entities earn their place in our ontology through superior explanatory power. Modal realism deserves acceptance on similar grounds, according to Lewis's pragmatic methodology. The plurality of concrete worlds solves philosophical problems better than any alternative. Lewis's position emerged from the confluence of several distinct philosophical traditions simultaneously. Quine's naturalism provided methodological constraints favoring ontological clarity over modal primitives. Kripke's semantics demonstrated the technical fruitfulness of possible worlds frameworks. Australian materialism, which Lewis encountered through extended visits, reinforced his concrete realism. Philosophers like Jack Smart and David Armstrong advocated robust scientific realism. They argued for taking successful scientific theories ontologically seriously without instrumentalist hedging. Lewis applied this realist attitude to metaphysics itself, not just to physics. If possible, worlds appear ineliminable from our best semantic and metaphysical theories. They exist. The history of modal realism thus reflects pragmatist, naturalist, and realist strands converging. Lewis synthesized these influences into a systematic metaphysical vision of unprecedented scope. Part 3. Counterpart Theory. Counterpart theory constitutes an essential component of Lewis's overall modal metaphysics. It addresses a fundamental challenge facing any concrete realism about possible worlds. Modal statements often seem to attribute properties to specific individuals across different possibilities. I might say that I could have been a mathematician instead of a philosopher. This statement appears to require that I, this very person, exist in other possible worlds. Standard possible world semantics allows transworld identity, where one individual inhabits multiple worlds. However, Lewis's metaphysics requires that each individual exist in exactly one world only. This constraint follows from his account of what unifies objects into single worlds. Worlds are maximal spatio-temporally connected regions, and objects are four-dimensional space-time worms. An object cannot span multiple worlds because worlds are causally isolated by definition. Lewis called this the problem of accidental intrinsics, which motivated rejecting transworld identity. Consider a bent rod that could have been straight throughout its entire existence. If the rod exists in multiple worlds, it is both bent and straight simultaneously. Shape constitutes an intrinsic property, meaning it depends only on the object itself. But standard metaphysics denies that objects can have incompatible intrinsic properties simultaneously. One solution posits that objects have temporal parts at different times. The rod is bent at some times and straight at others through different temporal parts. But this temporal solution fails for modal variation because modal parts seem metaphysically confused. An object cannot literally have both bent and straight modal parts existing simultaneously. The only coherent solution requires abandoning transworld identity altogether, according to Lewis. Counterpart theory provides Lewis's alternative account of how modal statements work. When I say I could have been a mathematician, I do not claim to exist elsewhere. Instead, I claim that someone sufficiently similar to me is a mathematician in another world. This other person is my counterpart, someone who represents me in modal space. Counterparts are individuals in other worlds who resemble me in relevant respects. The counterpart relation is similarity-based rather than identity-based fundamentally. My counterparts typically originated from similar genetic material and developmental conditions. They share many of my intrinsic features while differing in certain contingent properties. Whether someone counts as my counterpart depends on context and conversational purposes. In some contexts, only extremely similar individuals qualify as representing me modally. In other contexts, loose resemblance suffices for counterpart status. This context sensitivity explains why essentialist judgments often seem vague and variable. Could London have been founded in Scotland instead of England? The answer depends on which features we consider essential to London's identity. If location is essential, then no Scottish city could be London's counterpart. If historical continuity matters more than geography, Scottish counterparts might exist. Counterpart theory thus explains essentialist intuitions without positing mysterious essential properties. Essence becomes a matter of which similarities we privilege in assessing counterparthood. Lewis formalized counterpart theory through a set of axioms and translation rules. These allow systematic translation from modal logic into first-order quantification over worlds and counterparts. The first axiom states that nothing exists in no world, ensuring everything inhabits some world. The second axiom requires that nothing exists in more than one world simultaneously. Each individual is world-bound, existing in exactly one possible world. The third axiom states that something in a world may have multiple counterparts elsewhere. I might have counterparts who became mathematicians and others who became musicians. The fourth axiom states that nothing in a world has more than one counterpart there. Lewis initially endorsed a fifth axiom, stating that nothing is a counterpart of any worldmate. However, he later abandoned this axiom because counterpart relations depend on context. In certain contexts, even worldmates might serve as counterparts representing different possibilities. The sixth axiom states that everything is its own counterpart, making self-representation standard. The translation scheme converts modal formulas into counterpart theoretic equivalents systematically. Necessarily, P becomes every counterpart of every object satisfies P in its world. Possibly P becomes some counterpart of some object satisfies P in its world. This allows evaluating modal claims by checking facts about counterparts in concrete worlds. The translation yields a completely extensional language using only standard logical resources. no primitive modal operators appear in the counterpart theoretic translations at all. Lewis achieved his goal of reducing modality to quantification over concrete existence. Critics raised several objections to counterpart theory that Lewis needed to address. Saul Kripke formulated what became known as the Humphrey objection against counterpart theory. Hubert Humphrey lost the 1968 presidential election to Richard Nixon narrowly. When we say Humphrey could have won, we seem to mean that Humphrey himself wins elsewhere. But counterpart theory says some other person similar to Humphrey wins in another world. Kripke objected that Humphrey cares whether he wins, not whether some counterpart wins. The modal truth seems to concern Humphrey's possibilities, not another person's actualities. Lewis responded by embracing the apparent consequence rather than retreating from it. He argued that caring about one's modal properties just is caring about one's counterparts. When I care whether I could have succeeded, I care whether someone like me succeeds elsewhere. This seems strange initially, but Lewis claimed it captures what modal concern actually involves. Moreover, he noted that ersatz theories face analogous problems about representation and concern. If possibilities are abstract propositions, why should I care whether abstract propositions obtain? Counterpart theory generates some surprising logical results that differ from standard modal logic. In particular, it invalidates certain formulas that Kripke semantics validates. The Barson formula states that if possibly something is F, then something is possibly F. This seems obviously valid in standard modal logic with trans-world identity. But counterpart theory can falsify the Barkan formula under certain counterpart relation specifications. Suppose nothing actual has counterparts in some world, because nothing sufficiently similar exists there. Then possibly something is F might be true, because that world contains F things. But nothing is possibly F would be true, because actual things lack counterparts there. Lewis viewed this as a virtue rather than a defect of counterpart theory. The Barkan formula's intuitive appeal depends on assuming transworld identity implicitly. Counterpart theory also allows for contingent identity, which standard modal logic typically forbids. In Kripke semantics, if A equals B, then necessarily A equals B. Identity is necessary because the same object cannot fail to be self-identical. But counterpart theory permits situations where A equals B, while possibly A does not equal B. This happens when A's counterpart and B's counterpart are distinct in some other world. Lewis exploited this feature to address puzzles about material constitution and identity. Consider a statue and the lump of clay composing it at some particular time. They seem identical now, sharing all their parts and occupying the same space. Yet they have different modal properties because the lump could survive radical reshaping. The statue could not survive being squashed into a ball, but the lump obviously could. Counterpart theory resolves this by allowing the statue and lump to be identical but have different counterparts. The statue's counterparts are other statues in other worlds with similar forms. The lump's counterparts are other lumps, including ones with very different shapes. So the statue and lump can be identical while differing in their modal properties. This elegant solution to the constitution problem exemplifies counterpart theory's philosophical utility. Beyond its technical merits, counterpart theory embodies a distinctive metaphysical picture. It treats individuals as fundamentally located in single worlds rather than transcending worlds. Modal facts about individuals reduce to facts about similarity relations across worlds. No mysterious essential properties attached to objects independent of our representational practices. Essentialism becomes a pragmatic matter of which similarities we choose to privilege contextually. Part 4. Theoretical benefits and explanatory power. Lewis argued that modal realism deserves acceptance because it solves otherwise intractable philosophical problems. He systematically catalogued the theoretical benefits that concrete possible worlds provide. This pragmatic argument from explanatory power formed the core of his defense. Just as physicists posit unobservable entities like quarks for explanatory reasons, philosophers should accept worlds. The first major benefit concerns providing reductive analyses of modal notions. Modality appears throughout philosophy in discussions of necessity, possibility, and counterfactuals. Lewis wanted to explain these modal notions in purely non-modal terms. Modal realism achieves this by translating modal statements into quantifications over concrete worlds. To say something is possible means some world contains an instance of it. To say something is necessary means every world contains instances of it universally. This reduction eliminates primitive modal operators from our fundamental ontology completely. We need only ordinary quantifiers ranging over concrete objects in describing reality. Necessity and possibility become ordinary facts about what exists in various regions. This represents genuine philosophical progress by reducing obscure notions to clearer ones. The second benefit involves analyzing counterfactual conditionals, which appear ubiquitous in reasoning. We constantly make claims about what would have happened under different circumstances. If you had studied harder, you would have passed the examination. If the asteroid had missed Earth, dinosaurs would still exist today. These counterfactuals seem true or false, but what makes them true requires explanation. Lewis's semantics for counterfactuals uses possible worlds and similarity relations between them. A counterfactual is true if the consequent holds in the closest possible worlds where the antecedent holds. Closeness means overall similarity to the actual world across relevant dimensions. Closer worlds resemble actuality more than distant worlds do in their total character. This analysis only works if possible worlds are concrete entities capable of genuine similarity. Abstract ersatz worlds lack the intrinsic features needed for robust similarity comparisons. How similar are two maximally consistent sets of propositions, really? Similarity seems to require comparing concrete matters of particular fact. Modal realism provides the ontological resources needed for counterfactual analysis. The third benefit concerns explaining properties and propositions in a unified framework. Lewis developed an account where properties are classes of possible individuals. The property of being human consists of all humans across all possible worlds. This includes actual humans like us and merely possible humans elsewhere. Properties thus become sets, and we already accept sets in our ontology. We avoid mysterious abstract universals that must somehow be instantiated by particulars. Similarly, propositions become sets of possible worlds where those propositions are true. The proposition that snow is white consists of all worlds where snow is white. This elegant reduction treats both properties and propositions as constructions from possible worlds. It unifies our theories of meaning, thought, and metaphysical structure. The fourth benefit addresses semantic paradoxes and problems about meaning. Modal realism helps explain how expressions have meanings that determine truth conditions. The meaning of a sentence determines which possible worlds make it true. Two sentences are synonymous if true in exactly the same possible worlds. This intentional semantics, grounded in possible worlds, became standard in formal semantics. Linguists use possible worlds to analyze modal auxiliaries, conditionals, and temporal expressions. Lewis argued that only genuine possible worlds provide adequate semantic foundations. Ersatz worlds leave unexplained what makes them represent ways things could be. Concrete worlds represent automatically because they simply are those ways things could be. The fifth benefit concerns metaphysical questions about laws of nature and causation. Lewis developed a Humean account where laws supervene on the total distribution of local properties. The laws are those regularities that achieve optimal balance between simplicity and strength. This account requires quantifying over alternative possible patterns that could have obtained. Modal realism provides these alternative patterns as the actual patterns in other worlds. Similarly, Lewis analyzed causation using counterfactual dependence between events. Event C causes event E, if E would not have occurred without C occurring. This counterfactual analysis requires possible worlds to evaluate the relevant conditionals. The sixth benefit involves solving epistemological problems about modal knowledge. How do we know what is possible or necessary if we only observe the actual world? Lewis argued that modal realism makes modal knowledge as accessible as any a posteriori knowledge. We learn about other worlds by reasoning from our experience combined with recombination principles. If something occurs here, then duplicates of it occur elsewhere in different combinations. This grounds modal knowledge in ordinary inductive and abductive reasoning patterns. The seventh benefit concerns explaining why certain philosophical principles hold. The principle of plenitude states that every genuine possibility is realized somewhere. Modal realism entails plenitude directly because every possible world exists concretely. This explains why possibility and actuality coincide at the level of total reality. Nothing is merely possible from an absolute perspective spanning all worlds. Everything possible is actual somewhere in the totality of concrete existence. The eighth benefit addresses problems in ethics and practical reasoning. We evaluate actions by considering their consequences under various possible circumstances. Decision theory requires assigning probabilities and utilities to possible outcomes. Modal realism provides a clear ontology for these possible outcomes we consider. Lewis extended his framework to analyze probability and chance using possible worlds. Objective chances correspond to measures over sets of worlds matching certain patterns. This grounds probabilistic reasoning in facts about the distribution of worlds. The ninth benefit involves philosophy of mathematics and logical truth. Necessary truths, like mathematical theorems, hold in all possible worlds without exception. This explains why mathematical truths seem independent of contingent physical facts. Mathematics describes structural features common to all possible worlds simultaneously. Modal realism thus illuminates the special epistemic and metaphysical status of mathematics. The cumulative force of these benefits constitutes Lewis's main argument for modal realism. No competing theory matches its explanatory breadth and systematic unity. Ersatz theories either smuggle in primitive modality or fail to explain crucial phenomena. Actualist theories cannot adequately ground modal truths in non-modal facts. Modal primitivism simply refuses to explain modality, treating it as metaphysically basic. Only modal realism delivers genuine reduction alongside comprehensive explanatory power. Lewis acknowledged that his view conflicts with common-sense intuitions about reality. We ordinarily believe that only our world exists and other possibilities remain unactualized. But Lewis argued that philosophy often requires revising common sense for theoretical gains. Physics teaches that solid objects consist mostly of empty space between particles. Biology reveals that humans share ancestry with bacteria and all living things. Philosophy similarly should embrace counterintuitive truths when evidence sufficiently supports them. The method of reflective equilibrium guides theory choice by balancing costs and benefits. We weigh intuitive plausibility against explanatory power and theoretical elegance. Sometimes explanatory advantages justify accepting highly counterintuitive conclusions. Lewis believed modal realism crossed this threshold despite its radical ontology. The philosophical problems it solves are fundamental and otherwise appear unsolvable. The alternatives either leave mysteries unexplained or multiply unexplained primitives. Modal realism provides a unified metaphysical foundation for vast areas of philosophy. This theoretical unity and comprehensiveness represents a powerful virtue. Lewis compared his position to scientific theories that posit surprising entities for explanatory purposes. Atoms seemed absurd before evidence accumulated supporting atomic theory conclusively. Part 5. Major Objections and Critiques. Modal realism faces formidable objections from philosophers across diverse theoretical orientations. The incredulous stare objection questions the theory's radical departure from common sense. Lewis himself acknowledged this objection prominently in On the Plurality of Worlds. Common sense tells us that only our world exists, and other possibilities remain unreal. Modal realism claims infinitely many concrete universes exist beyond our observational access. These universes contain donkeys, dragons, talking fish, and every conceivable variation. The theory multiplies entities far beyond what most philosophers consider ontologically acceptable. Critics argue that no theoretical benefits justify such extravagant metaphysical commitments. Occam's razor counsels ontological parsimony, preferring theories with fewer entity types. Modal realism maximally violates parsimony by positing infinitely many complete universes. Lewis responded that we should measure ontological cost qualitatively rather than quantitatively. His theory posits only one kind of thing fundamentally, namely concrete physical objects. The objects simply happen to be scattered across many disconnected spatio-temporal regions. This is not worse than positing both concrete and abstract objects, as ersatz theories do. Furthermore, Lewis argued that common sense cannot serve as ultimate arbiter in philosophy. Philosophy exists precisely because common sense often misleads us about difficult questions. We should trust systematic theoretical virtues over unreflective, intuitive reactions. The epistemological objection challenges how we could know about causally isolated worlds. If other possible worlds have no causal connection to ours, they seem epistemically inaccessible completely. Knowledge typically requires some causal or evidential connection to its objects. We know about electrons because they causally affect detection equipment we build. We know about distant galaxies because light from them reaches our telescopes eventually. But other possible worlds emit no light, send no signals, and leave no traces here. How could we possibly have knowledge or justified beliefs about them? Peter Forrest developed this objection into an argument undermining inductive reasoning itself. Modal realism entails that worlds exist where our senses systematically deceive us. Worlds exist where bread always poisoned people until today, when it suddenly becomes nutritious. Worlds exist where the future radically differs from past patterns for no reason. If these worlds exist, how do we know we do not inhabit one of them? Our past experience provides no evidence against being in such a world. This seems to undermine our justification for inductive inferences from past to future. If modal realism makes skepticism irrefutable, that constitutes a devastating reductio ad absurdum. The modal irrelevance objection questions whether other worlds explain anything about our world. Suppose infinitely many concrete universes exist exactly as Lewis claims they do. This fact about what exists elsewhere seems irrelevant to modal truths about our world. Whether I could have been a mathematician depends on my intrinsic nature and circumstances. It seems not to depend on whether some distant person similar to me studies mathematics. The existence of mathematical counterparts appears neither necessary nor sufficient for my possibilities. Lewis's theory seems to change the subject rather than explain modality. It tells us about what happens elsewhere rather than what could happen here. The Humphrey objection, mentioned earlier, exemplifies this modal irrelevance problem. Humphrey cares about whether he could have won, not whether someone else did win. Counterpart theory seems to substitute a different claim for the original modal statement. This suggests modal realism fails to capture what modal discourse actually means. The linguistic objection argues that modal realism misinterprets our modal language. When we say something is possible, we do not mean that it exists somewhere else. We mean that circumstances here could have been different in specified ways. Modal language talks about alternative configurations of this world, not other worlds. James Ross argued that Lewis passes away counterfactual utterances into unintended meanings. We lose track of what we originally meant when translating into talk about other worlds. Hilary Putnam objected that ways things could be are simply properties or characteristics. The whole world could have had different properties without being a different world entirely. We need not posit other concrete worlds to make sense of alternative possibilities. Properties and states of affairs suffice for explaining modal truth without extravagant ontology. The moral objection raises ethical concerns about treating merely possible people equally with actual people. If all possible worlds are equally real, then all their inhabitants equally deserve moral consideration. Actual people have no special moral status justifying preferential treatment over merely possible people. But this leads to absurd ethical conclusions that contradict basic moral intuitions. Suppose I can save 10 actual people or create 20 happy, merely possible people. Common morality says, I should save the actual people without hesitation. But if modal realism is true, the 20 merely possible people exist just as genuinely elsewhere. My choice affects which world I inhabit, not which people exist absolutely. The 20 happy people exist somewhere regardless of my choice about which world actualizes. This seems to make all moral choices equally permissible from a cosmic perspective. Every possible moral situation obtains somewhere in the plurality of worlds. The moral objection thus accuses modal realism of undermining ethics by trivializing choices. The metaphysical objection questions whether Lewis's ontology is even coherent. Can infinitely many disconnected concrete universes really constitute a single coherent reality? What unifies them into one totality rather than simply being separate realities entirely? If they are causally isolated, in what sense do they collectively exist? Lewis claimed that all worlds together constitute reality, or the plurality of worlds. But critics argue this plurality seems to lack any unifying principle making it one thing. Perhaps we should say reality contains multiple realities rather than one unified reality. This threatens to make Lewis's claims incoherent or merely verbal stipulations. The recombination objection targets Lewis's principle of plenitude specifically. Lewis claimed that any recombination of duplicates of actual particulars is possible. But this principle seems not to guarantee all possibilities that intuitively should exist. Consider possibilities that require genuinely novel entities absent from our world entirely. Alien properties that nothing actual instantiates seem possible but lack recombination grounds. Similarly, worlds with different fundamental laws might exceed what recombination can generate. Lewis acknowledged this limitation, but argued recombination captures most central cases adequately. For truly alien possibilities, he relied on additional principles beyond simple recombination. The problem of empty worlds challenges Lewis's claim that every world contains concrete objects necessarily. It seems logically possible that nothing exists, that reality might have been completely empty. But Lewis's mereology and metaphysics seem to rule out empty worlds. If worlds are spatio-temporal regions, then empty spacetime itself constitutes something concrete. Lewis argued that mereology does not permit empty sums, so completely empty worlds are impossible. But critics question whether metaphysical theories should preclude apparently coherent possibilities. The problem of impossible worlds raises questions about modal realism's scope and completeness. Some semantic and logical phenomena seem to require impossible worlds where contradictions hold. People believe impossible things, reason about contradictory scenarios, and imagine incoherent situations. A complete theory of content and meaning might need impossible worlds alongside possible ones. But Lewis's framework provides only possible worlds obeying logical consistency constraints. Extended modal realism posits impossible worlds as additional ontological commitments. However, it remains unclear how concrete worlds could contain genuine contradictions. This suggests limits on what modal realism can explain, even if we accept its core claims. The problem of primitive modality questions whether Lewis truly eliminated modal primitives. His recombination principles appeal to possible recombinations and possible duplicates. But what makes something a possible recombination rather than an impossible one? Lewis needs some notion of possibility to ground which arrangements count as possible worlds. Critics argue this shows that modality remains primitive even in Lewis's supposedly reductive framework. He relocates modal primitives rather than truly eliminating them from his metaphysics. The circularity objection claims modal realism presupposes what it purports to explain. We identify possible worlds as maximal consistent ways things could be. But consistency and possibility are modal notions requiring independent analysis. Lewis cannot use possible worlds to explain modality if identifying worlds requires understanding modality. This threatens to make the entire project viciously circular rather than genuinely reductive. The problem of transworld identity for properties challenges Lewis's account of property identity. Properties are classes of possible individuals according to Lewis's theory. But how do we know that the same property appears in different worlds? Part 6. Lewis's responses and defensive strategies. Lewis developed sophisticated responses to objections that reveal the depth of his systematic thinking. Against the incredulous stare, he argued that philosophical theories should not be judged by initial intuitive reactions alone. Many successful scientific theories initially provoked incredulity before becoming accepted orthodoxy. Atomic theory seemed absurd until evidence made it undeniable to reasonable people. The heliocentric model contradicted everyday experience that the Earth stands still. Evolutionary theory struck many as obviously false because species seemed fixed eternally. In each case, explanatory power eventually overcame intuitive resistance through sustained reflection. Philosophy should employ the same methodology, privileging systematic theoretical virtues. Lewis insisted that we evaluate theories holistically by weighing all costs against all benefits. Modal realism's counterintuitiveness represents a real cost in the overall balance sheet. But the theoretical benefits tip the scales decisively in favor of accepting the view. No alternative theory explains as much while avoiding comparable or worse problems. Furthermore, Lewis questioned whether our intuitions actually oppose modal realism as strongly as critics claim. We ordinarily accept that possibilities are real, in some sense requiring explanation. We distinguish genuine from spurious possibilities, implying that possibility has objective grounds. Modal realism simply takes seriously the reality of possibilities we already acknowledge. It gives concrete content to possibility rather than leaving it primitive and mysterious. Against the epistemological objection, Lewis employed several distinct argumentative strategies. First, he argued that modal realism does not face unique epistemological problems beyond those facing any abstract entity. We lack causal contact with mathematical objects like numbers and sets. Yet, philosophers widely accept that we have mathematical knowledge despite this causal isolation. If mathematical knowledge is possible without causal contact, modal knowledge could be also. Second, Lewis distinguished between explaining how modal knowledge is possible and explaining particular modal beliefs. Modal realism aims to provide truth conditions for modal statements, not a complete epistemology. We can know that some worlds contain unicorns by reasoning from the principles of recombination. We know horses exist, and we know horns exist, so recombination guarantees their combination exists somewhere. This combines ordinary empirical knowledge with a priori reasoning about logical possibilities. Third, Lewis argued that his epistemological position matches mathematical realism's epistemic situation. Mathematical Platonists face identical questions about knowing abstract causally inert entities. Yet mathematical knowledge seems unproblematic once we accept mathematical objects exist. Similarly, modal knowledge should seem unproblematic once we accept concrete possible worlds. Against Forrest's skeptical worry about deceiving worlds, Lewis offered a pragmatic response. The mere possibility of deception does not undermine knowledge unless we have specific reason for doubt. Skeptical scenarios exist as possibilities, but we have overwhelming evidence against inhabiting them. Our accumulated experience strongly supports that our world follows reliable patterns. The fact that other worlds exist where patterns break provides no evidence against our inductions. Lewis compared this to the problem of other minds in traditional epistemology. Zombies and deceivers might exist, but this does not undermine our knowledge of other minds. We justifiably believe what our evidence supports most strongly, regardless of alternative possibilities. The existence of deceptive worlds elsewhere does not make our world equally likely to be deceptive. Against the modal irrelevance objection, Lewis distinguished constitutive from causal explanations carefully. Modal realism aims to provide truth conditions for modal statements, not causal explanations. What makes it true that I could have been a mathematician is not a causal matter. Rather, it is a matter of what exists across total reality, including other worlds. Just as what makes it true that 7 plus 5 equals 12 involves mathematical facts. These facts do not cause the truth, but constitute what the truth consists in. Modal facts similarly consist in facts about what exists in various possible worlds. The existence of mathematical counterparts is precisely what grounds my modal properties on Lewis's view. This is not changing the subject, but revealing what modal properties fundamentally are. Against the Humphrey objections specifically, Lewis offered a two-pronged response. First, he argued that counterpart theory does not change the subject of modal claims. When I say I could have been a mathematician, I make a claim about myself and my possibilities. Counterpart theory specifies the truth conditions for this claim without altering its content. The claim is true if and only if some counterpart of mine is a mathematician somewhere. This constitutes a reductive explanation of what my modal properties consist in metaphysically. Second, Lewis embraced the consequence that modal concern involves concern for counterparts. He argued that this captures something important about the nature of modal concern. When I care whether I could have succeeded, I care about whether people like me succeed. This seems less strange once we recognize that I care about my past and future selves similarly. My past self is not identical to my present self in the strictest sense. Both are temporal parts of a four-dimensional whole connected by psychological continuity. Caring about my future self involves caring about a related but distinct person. Similarly, caring about modal alternatives involves caring about similar possible people. Lewis acknowledged this requires revising our ordinary understanding of self-concern somewhat. But he argued that philosophical reflection often requires such conceptual refinements. Against the linguistic objection, Lewis distinguished between surface grammar and deep logical form. Modal statements superficially seem to describe alternative configurations of this world, but their deep logical structure involves quantification over other worlds, according to Lewis. Natural language often misleads us about the metaphysical structure underlying linguistic phenomena. Proper names seem to describe particular objects, but Russell showed they abbreviate descriptions. Similarly, modal operators seem primitive, but they abbreviate quantification over worlds. The fact that ordinary speakers do not recognize this does not refute the analysis. Semantic theory aims to reveal hidden structure, not merely to codify surface appearances. Against Putnam's objection about properties, Lewis argued that properties alone cannot ground modality adequately. We need to explain which properties the world could have instantiated but does not actually instantiate. Uninstantiated properties are modal entities requiring their own analysis and explanation. Lewis's concrete worlds provide the grounds for property instantiation across modal space. Properties become classes of individuals across worlds rather than mysterious abstract universals. This reduces talk of uninstantiated properties to talk of individuals in other worlds. Against the moral objection, Lewis offered several responses defending his ethical position. First, he distinguished between ethical theory and metaethics, noting that modal realism concerns metaethics primarily. It provides the metaphysical foundation for modal and counterfactual claims used in ethics. But it does not dictate substantive ethical conclusions about right and wrong. We can maintain ordinary ethical views while accepting modal realism as metaphysical background. Second, Lewis argued that merely possible people have no claims on us because they are not here. Actuality is indexical, so actual people are simply the people we spatio-temporally relate to. Our ethical obligations concern those we can affect through causal interaction. Causally isolated people in other worlds fall outside our sphere of moral responsibility. Third, Lewis noted that consequentialism does not require considering all possible consequences absolutely. It requires maximizing good among accessible outcomes we can actually bring about. We cannot make merely possible people exist by our choices, so they are not relevant to our decisions. Our choices select which world we inhabit, but all worlds exist regardless. Against the metaphysical objection about unifying the plurality, Lewis appealed to mereological principles. All worlds collectively form a mereological sum, a fusion of all concrete objects. This fusion exists just as any mereological sum of scattered objects exists. The solar system exists as a scattered object despite its parts being spatially separated. Similarly, reality exists as a scattered object with maximally separated parts called worlds. Mereology provides the unifying principle, making the plurality one thing. Against the recombination objection, Lewis acknowledged that recombination has limits. He supplemented recombination with additional principles addressing alien properties and novel entities. He suggested that perfectly natural properties exist as universals shared across worlds. These provide the building blocks from which alien properties can be constructed. While Lewis preferred avoiding universals, he recognized they might be necessary for complete plenitude. Against the empty worlds objection, Lewis maintained his position that empty worlds are metaphysically impossible. He argued that our intuitions about empty possibilities stem from imagining ourselves observing nothing. But genuine nothingness includes no observers, no space-time, no anything at all. This scenario may be logically describable, but not genuinely metaphysically possible. His mereological principles preclude empty worlds by requiring all worlds to contain something. Against the primitive modality objection, Lewis distinguished between modal and non-modal uses of terms. When he speaks of possible recombinations, he means actual arrangements in other worlds. The recombination principles can be stated without using modal vocabulary explicitly. They quantify over actual worlds and actual arrangements existing throughout modal space. Against the circularity objection, Lewis denied that identifying worlds requires prior modal understanding. Worlds are maximal spatio-temporally connected regions of concrete objects. Spatio-temporal connectedness is a non-modal relation holding between parts of worlds. We identify worlds by this physical relation, not by modal criteria requiring consistency or possibility. The overall pattern of Lewis's defensive strategy involves systematic application of several principles. He consistently trades intuitive costs for theoretical benefits when the balance favors his theory. He refuses to multiply unexplained primitives, insisting on genuine reductions wherever possible. He maintains methodological parity between philosophy and successful natural sciences throughout. Part 7. Applications across philosophy. Modal realism's influence extends far beyond technical debates about modality into numerous philosophical domains. Its framework provides tools for addressing long-standing problems in metaphysics, semantics, and epistemology. The philosophy of language represents perhaps the most fertile ground for modal realist applications. Intentional semantics uses possible worlds to analyze the meanings of sentences and linguistic expressions. The intention of an expression is a function from possible worlds to extensions. The intention of a name maps each world to the object that name designates there. The intention of a predicate maps each world to the set of objects satisfying it there. Two expressions are synonymous if they have the same intention across all possible worlds. This framework elegantly handles expressions that differ in meaning despite having identical actual extensions. Consider the phrases creature with a heart and creature with kidneys in actual biology. These expressions apply to exactly the same actual organisms because hearts and kidneys always occur together. Yet they clearly differ in meaning, as we can imagine creatures with hearts but no kidneys. Possible world semantics explains this by noting that their intentions differ at non-actual worlds. Modal realism grounds this semantic framework in facts about concrete objects across real worlds. Linguists apply possible worlds to analyze modal auxiliaries like must, might, can, and should systematically. These words modify the truth conditions of sentences by introducing quantification over accessible worlds. Angelika Kratzer developed influential theories of modals using conversational backgrounds and ordering sources. Different modal flavors like epistemic, deontic, and circumstantial correspond to different accessibility relations. Epistemic modals concern what is compatible with our knowledge or evidence. Deontic modals concern what is compatible with moral or legal obligations. Circumstantial modals concern what is compatible with relevant facts about the situation. Modal realism provides the metaphysical foundation, making these semantic theories genuinely explanatory rather than merely formal. Conditional sentences beyond simple counterfactuals also receive modal realist treatments. Indicative conditionals state what follows, given that something is actually the case. Subjunctive conditionals state what would follow if something contrary to fact were true. Both types involve reasoning about alternative scenarios represented by possible worlds. Probability and belief operators in formal epistemology similarly exploit possible worlds frameworks. An agent believes a proposition if that proposition is true in all worlds compatible with their beliefs. An agent knows a proposition if it is true in all epistemically accessible worlds and actually true. Probabilistic beliefs assign measures over sets of worlds representing evidentially equivalent scenarios. The framework extends to temporal semantics, where moments or intervals function analogously to worlds. Prior and later times are like alternative worlds reached by moving through the temporal dimension. Tense operators work similarly to modal operators, but quantify overtimes rather than worlds. This suggests deep structural connections between temporal and modal aspects of reality. In metaphysics proper, modal realism contributes to debates about essence and accidents. Essential properties are those an object has in all worlds where it exists. Accidental properties are those it has in some worlds but lacks in other worlds. Counterpart theory refines this by making essence context dependent through variable counterpart relations. Different contexts privilege different similarity relations when determining which properties are essential. This explains why essentialist intuitions vary depending on what features we consider relevant. Identity and distinctness puzzles receive illumination from counterpart theoretic resources. The statue and the clay composing it can be identical, yet have different modal properties. They have different counterparts in other worlds, despite being identical in this world. Similarly, an object and its temporal stages can be identical, despite having different temporal properties. Mereology, the formal theory of parts and wholes, intersects deeply with modal metaphysics. Lewis defended unrestricted mereological composition, where any objects whatever compose a further object. This principle generates enormous ontological abundance, with arbitrary fusions counting as genuine entities. Modal realism multiplies this abundance across infinitely many worlds containing composed objects. Questions about persistence through time connect to modal questions about transworld identity. Endurantists claim objects are wholly present at each moment they exist. Perdurantists claim objects are four-dimensional worms with temporal parts at different times. Lewis advocated perdurantism partly because it parallels his counterpart theory's treatment of modality. Just as objects have modal parts in counterpart theory, they have temporal parts in perdurantism. Both theories avoid positing single objects with incompatible intrinsic properties. Causation receives extensive treatment within Lewis's overall philosophical system. He analyzed causation using counterfactual dependence between distinct events. Event C causes event E, when E counterfactually depends on C occurring. This means E would not have occurred in the closest worlds, where C fails to occur. Causal chains involve sequences of counterfactual dependencies linking distant events through intermediate stages. This analysis requires possible worlds to evaluate the relevant counterfactual conditionals. Only concrete worlds provide the similarity relations needed for determining closeness between worlds. Laws of nature emerge from Lewis's human supervenience thesis, combined with best system analysis. Humean supervenience states that all facts supervene on the distribution of local intrinsic properties. Everything true about the world reduces to facts about which properties occur, where and when. Laws are not metaphysically fundamental, but rather emerge from patterns in property instantiation. The laws are axioms of the system, balancing simplicity and strength in describing actual patterns. This account involves implicit comparison with alternative possible regularities to define optimal balance. Modal realism provides these alternative regularities as actual patterns in other possible worlds. Dispositions and powers pose special challenges that Lewis addressed using conditional analyses. To say glass is fragile means it would break if subjected to suitable forces. This counterfactual conditional again requires possible worlds for proper semantic evaluation. Critics argue that simple conditional analyses fail for various reasons involving masking and thinking. Lewis refined his account multiple times to handle increasingly sophisticated counterexamples. The debate continues about whether purely conditional analyses can capture dispositional properties. Mental states receive functionalist analyses in Lewis's philosophy of mind. A mental state is whatever plays a specified causal functional role in the organism's cognitive economy. Pain is whatever internal state is typically caused by tissue damage and causes avoidance behavior. This functional characterization involves implicit quantification over possible causal structures. Ramsey sentences formalize functional definitions by replacing theoretical terms with bound variables. The Ramsey sentence for a theory states that some entities satisfy the theory's structural constraints. Lewis used this technique extensively to provide reductive analyses of theoretical vocabulary. Modal realism supports these analyses by providing the ontological background for evaluating them. Philosophy of mathematics connects to modal realism through structuralism and modal accounts of mathematical truth. Mathematical structures exist as patterns instantiated by objects across various possible worlds. The natural number structure exists wherever objects stand in successor relations forming infinite progressions. This suggests mathematics describes structural features shared by many possible worlds simultaneously. Lewis's book, Parts of Classes, attempted reducing set theory to mereology and plural quantification. He later expressed dissatisfaction with certain aspects of this project's execution. Nevertheless, the work exemplifies his commitment to systematic reductive metaphysics throughout philosophy. Decision theory and rational choice theory employ possible worlds to represent alternative outcomes. Agents choose actions by evaluating expected utilities across possible consequences of their choices. Each possible world represents one way events might unfold following different decision options. Probabilities measure over sets of worlds representing uncertainty about which world obtains. Game theory extends this framework to strategic interactions among multiple rational agents. Each strategy profile determines which possible world becomes actual through the agent's joint choices. Nash equilibria involve strategy profiles where no agent improves their outcome by unilateral deviation. These equilibria correspond to stable points in the space of possible outcomes generated by strategic choices. Social contract theory in ethics similarly exploits possible worlds to represent hypothetical agreements. We evaluate institutions by considering what rational agents would agree to behind a veil of ignorance. This involves reasoning about alternative possible worlds where we might occupy different social positions. Modal realism thus provides conceptual resources permeating contemporary analytic philosophy comprehensively. Its influence appears even in work by philosophers who reject Lewis's concrete realism. The possible worlds framework has become indispensable for precise formulation of philosophical theories. Whether we interpret worlds concretely or abstractly, they structure how philosophers analyze concepts. Lewis's contribution lies partly in showing how powerful this framework becomes when taken literally. He demonstrated that philosophical problems yield to systematic treatment using possible worlds ontology. This methodological lesson persists even among those who prefer Azat's alternatives to concrete realism. The applications reviewed here represent only a fraction of modal realism's philosophical reach. Additional applications appear in philosophy of science, philosophy of religion, and applied ethics. The framework's versatility and precision explain its enduring appeal despite ongoing metaphysical controversies. Part 8. Competing Theories. Modal realism competes with several alternative approaches to understanding modality and possible worlds. These competitors attempt to capture modal realism's benefits while avoiding its controversial ontological commitments. Ersatz modal realism treats possible worlds as abstract representations rather than concrete universes. These representations might be linguistic entities, propositions, properties, or maximally specific states of affairs. All ersatz theories share the goal of explaining modality using less extravagant ontology than Lewis requires. Linguistic ersatzism identifies possible worlds with maximally consistent sets of sentences in some ideal language. A possible world consists of all sentences describing one complete way reality could be. This world's properties are true sentences in that maximal, consistent set. Linguistic ersatzism appeals to nominalists who prefer concrete inscriptions or utterances over abstract objects. However, Lewis raised decisive objections against linguistic approaches to possible worlds. First, languages are conventional human constructions that might fail to express all genuine possibilities. Nothing guarantees that our language contains resources to describe every possible situation. Some possibilities might be inexpressible in any language humans can construct or comprehend. Linguistic ersatzism thus threatens to make possibility depend on linguistic limitations inappropriately. Second, determining which sentence sets are maximally consistent requires primitive modal understanding. Consistency is a modal notion stating that sentences could all be true together. Linguistic ersatzism cannot reduce modality to non-modal facts if consistency itself remains unexplained. This circularity undermines the reductive ambitions that motivate ersatz theories generally. Third, sentences are about things in the actual world, making them unsuitable for representing alien possibilities. A sentence about dragons refers to actual dragons, if any exist, otherwise it lacks reference. But we need to represent worlds containing dragons, even though no actual dragons exist anywhere. Linguistic items seem inadequate for representing possibilities outstripping actual existence. Propositional ersatzism identifies possible worlds with maximally specific, consistent propositions or sets of propositions. A possible world is the proposition that reality is completely thus, and so this avoids linguistic relativism because propositions are meanings rather than linguistic expressions. Different languages can express the same proposition using different sentences. However, propositional ersatzism faces similar problems about circularity and alien possibilities. What makes a proposition maximally specific and consistent without appealing to possibility? How can propositions represent alien properties never instantiated in the actual world? Furthermore, many philosophers identify propositions with sets of possible worlds themselves. If propositions are sets of worlds, we cannot coherently identify worlds with propositions circularly. This threatens to make propositional ersatzism either circular or committed to mysterious unexplained entities. Property ersatzism, advocated by Robert Stolnaker, identifies possible worlds with maximally specific properties. A possible world is the property that reality would instantiate were that world actualized. Properties are ways things could be, making them natural candidates for representing possibilities. The actual world is the one maximally specific property that reality actually instantiates. Property ersatzism avoids problems about language by using properties as representational vehicles. Properties seem more fundamental than linguistic items and avoid conventional aspects of language. However, Lewis objected that uninstantiated properties are themselves modal entities requiring explanation. What grounds the distinction between genuine properties and merely grammatical predicates? The property of being a round square seems not to be a genuine property at all. But the property of being a unicorn seems genuine despite having no actual instances. This distinction between genuine and spurious properties appears to be fundamentally modal. Property ersatzism thus covertly relies on primitive modality in individuating genuine properties. States of affairs, ersatzism, identifies possible worlds with maximally comprehensive, non-obtaining states of affairs. A state of affairs is something like a fact or situation that may or may not obtain. The actual world consists of all states of affairs that actually obtain. Non-actual possible worlds consist of alternative combinations of states of affairs. This approach faces questions about the ontological status of non-obtaining states of affairs. Do non-obtaining states of affairs exist, and if so, in what sense do they exist? If they exist, then we have committed to abstract entities that seem no less mysterious than concrete worlds. If they do not exist, then we cannot use them to ground modal truths adequately. Lewis argued that all ersatz theories face a fundamental dilemma about their representational mechanisms. Either ersatz worlds represent possibilities accurately, or they potentially misrepresent them. If representation is automatic and infallible, then ersatz worlds are not genuinely representational at all. They would be the things represented rather than representations of those things. But if representation can fail or be inaccurate, we need an account of correct versus incorrect representation. This account will require explaining what makes ersatz worlds represent possibilities rather than impossibilities. Such explanations inevitably invoke primitive modal notions, undermining the reductive project. Only concrete possible worlds represent automatically by being rather than representing ways things could be. Actualism denies that non-actual possible objects exist in any sense whatsoever. Only actual entities exist, and there are no possibilia beyond what actually obtains. Actualists typically analyze modal discourse using operators rather than quantification over worlds. Necessarily and possibly are primitive logical operators not reducible to extensional quantification. Alvin Plantinga developed an influential actualist theory using maximally comprehensive propositions. Possible worlds are maximally specific propositions that could have been true but actually are not. These propositions exist in the actual world as abstract objects rather than existing elsewhere concretely. Plantinga's actualism thus accepts abstract objects while rejecting non-actual concrete objects. Lewis objected that this position multiplies primitive modal notions rather than reducing them. The notion of a proposition that could have been true employs irreducible modality. Actualism abandons the goal of reductive analysis in favor of accepting modality as metaphysically primitive. This makes actualism methodologically conservative, but explanatorily less ambitious than modal realism. Combinatorialism, developed by David Armstrong, attempts reducing possibilities to recombinations of actual elements. Possible worlds are constructed by rearranging actual property instances according to certain principles. We can duplicate actual particulars and recombine them into new configurations not actually realized. These combinations exist as abstract structural possibilities rather than concrete physical arrangements. Combinatorialism aims to capture Lewis's recombination intuitions while avoiding commitment to concrete non-actual worlds. However, it faces difficulties explaining exactly what these abstract combinatorial possibilities are. Are they propositions, properties, states of affairs, or some other kind of abstract entity? The theory seems to require abstract possibilia, undermining its claim to avoid objectionable ontological commitments. Furthermore, combinatorialism struggles with alien possibilities that exceed what actual elements can generate. Properties or objects that nothing actual instantiates or resembles cannot emerge from pure recombination. Modal fictionalism treats possible worlds talk as a useful fiction rather than literal truth. We speak as if possible worlds exist for purposes of semantic and metaphysical analysis. But this talk should be understood instrumentally rather than as describing real entities. According to the standard fictionalist line, modal claims embed within a fictional prefix. According to the fiction of possible worlds, something is possible if and only if some world contains it. The fiction operates like a theoretical framework we adopt for its practical utility. Gideon Rosen developed sophisticated versions of modal fictionalism addressing technical objections. He distinguished between timid fictionalism that preserves ordinary modal discourse's truth values. Timid fictionalism says modal claims remain true, but their possible worlds paraphrases are fictional. Bold fictionalism says modal claims themselves are strictly false, but useful fictions. Modal fictionalism avoids ontological commitment to possible worlds while preserving their theoretical utility. However, it faces challenges explaining why this particular fiction proves so useful and successful. Why should a literally false theory about non-existent worlds illuminate genuine modal facts? The fiction's success seems to require that reality has a structure making the fiction appropriate somehow. This structure presumably involves genuine modal facts that the fiction helps us articulate. But then we need an account of these modal facts, independent of the fictional framework. Modal fictionalism risks postponing rather than solving fundamental questions about modality's nature. Primitivism accepts modality as a basic feature of reality, not reducible to anything more fundamental. Necessity and possibility are primitive operators requiring no further metaphysical explanation or analysis. We understand modal notions directly through competence with modal language and reasoning. Kit Fine and others defend primitivism by arguing that reduction attempts inevitably fail or involve circularity. Modal notions appear ineliminable from philosophical theorizing, no matter which reductive strategy we attempt. Primitivism abandons the reductive ambitions that motivated Lewis's entire project from its inception. Lewis viewed this as a significant theoretical cost because primitive modality seems metaphysically mysterious. How can we understand what necessity consists in if we refuse to explain it? Primitivism leaves fundamental questions unanswered that philosophical analysis should address. However, primitivists argue that some notions must be primitive on pain of infinite regress. Modality might be among the fundamental concepts requiring no further reduction or explanation. Modal conventionalism traces modal truths to linguistic conventions governing modal vocabulary's use. Necessary truths are those we conventionally refuse to reject under any circumstances. This deflationary approach treats modality as fundamentally epistemic rather than metaphysical. Quine's skepticism about modality partly motivated this conventionalist attitude toward modal discourse. Lewis rejected conventionalism because it seems unable to explain why conventions take the forms they do. Why do we conventionally treat mathematical truths as necessary rather than contingent? Presumably because mathematics describes structures common to all possible ways reality could be. This explanation presupposes genuine modality rather than explaining it through linguistic convention. Each competing theory faces distinctive challenges that Lewis carefully documented in his writings. No alternative matches. Modal realism's combination of explanatory power and systematic unity, according to Lewis. Yet most philosophers find modal realism's ontological costs prohibitive despite its theoretical virtues. The debate continues about which balance of costs and benefits proves most philosophically defensible. Contemporary philosophy exhibits a pluralistic landscape where various approaches coexist competitively. Many philosophers use possible worlds heuristically while remaining agnostic about their metaphysical status. Others develop hybrid views, combining elements from multiple approaches into eclectic frameworks. The persistence of this pluralism suggests that no single theory has achieved decisive victory yet. Part 9. Methodological Issues and Boundary Cases. Modal realism raises profound questions about philosophical methodology and the limits of systematic theorizing. Lewis's approach exemplifies a particular vision of philosophy's aims and appropriate methods. He practiced what might be called systematic constructive metaphysics in the grand rationalist tradition. This involves building comprehensive theories that unify disparate phenomena under common explanatory principles. Lewis believed philosophy should aim for the same kind of systematic unity that successful scientific theories achieve. Just as physics unifies mechanics, thermodynamics, and electromagnetism, philosophy should unify metaphysics, semantics, and epistemology. This methodology privileges theoretical virtues like simplicity, explanatory power, and systematic integration. Lewis judged theories holistically by weighing all costs against all benefits simultaneously. No single consideration proves decisive, but the overall balance determines which theory deserves acceptance. This reflects the method of reflective equilibrium that Goodman and Rawls developed in different contexts. We start with initial commitments, both at the level of particular cases and general principles. Then we revise both levels iteratively until achieving coherent equilibrium between them. Sometimes particular intuitions yield to general theoretical considerations, pushing toward revision. Sometimes theoretical principles get modified to accommodate recalcitrant intuitions, resisting abandonment. Lewis typically favored revising intuitions rather than theoretical principles when conflicts arose. He believed that systematic theoretical advantages justify significant revisions to pre-theoretical commitments. This methodological stance distinguishes Lewis from philosophers who privilege conceptual analysis or ordinary language. Philosophical analysis aims to articulate our pre-existing concepts rather than revising them substantially. Lewis rejected this constraint, arguing that philosophy should discover truth rather than codify usage. Our concepts might be confused or inadequate for capturing reality's fundamental structure. Philosophy improves concepts rather than simply describing them as they currently exist in common sense. This progressive attitude toward conceptual revision connects Lewis to scientific realism's philosophical spirit. Scientists revise concepts like mass, energy, and force as theories develop and evidence accumulates. Philosophers should similarly revise concepts like possibility, causation, and property as understanding deepens. However, critics question whether this methodology gives sufficient weight to conceptual constraints. If theories can freely revise our concepts, how do we ensure theories address the original questions? Modal realism might change the subject rather than explaining modality if it revises modal concepts too drastically. Lewis needed to show that his revised concepts remain recognizably connected to pre-theoretical modal notions. He attempted this by demonstrating that modal realism preserves most central features of ordinary modal discourse. It validates most intuitively valid modal inferences and invalidates most intuitively invalid ones. The theory respects the logical relationships between necessity, possibility, and contingency that ordinary reasoning assumes. This provides evidence that modal realism captures the same phenomena ordinary modal talk concerns. Another methodological issue concerns the appropriate role of formal logic in philosophical theorizing. Lewis made extensive use of formal semantic frameworks in developing and defending his views. He translated philosophical claims into precise logical languages amenable to rigorous evaluation. This formal approach enabled clear assessment of theory's logical consequences and mutual relationships. However, some philosophers worry that formalization distorts philosophical problems by oversimplifying them. Natural language modal discourse exhibits subtleties that formal systems might fail to capture adequately. Context, sensitivity, vagueness, and pragmatic factors influence how we interpret modal statements. Formal semantics might impose artificial precision on phenomena that are inherently flexible and context-dependent. Lewis acknowledged these concerns but maintained that formalization clarifies rather than distorts. Precision helps us identify exactly where disagreements lie and which assumptions generate which conclusions. We can always refine formal systems to accommodate additional subtleties as we discover them. The methodology exemplifies the ideal of philosophy as continuous with natural science. Quine advocated naturalism, treating philosophy as part of the scientific enterprise rather than separate from it. Lewis adopted this naturalistic stance while extending it to metaphysics beyond epistemology and philosophy of science. He believed metaphysical questions have objective answers discoverable through systematic theoretical inquiry. This contrasts with deflationary approaches treating metaphysical disputes as merely verbal or conventional. Carnap famously distinguished internal questions within a linguistic framework from external questions about frameworks. Internal questions have clear answers determined by framework rules and empirical investigation. External questions about which framework to adopt seem conventional rather than factual, according to Carnap. Lewis rejected this distinction, insisting that metaphysical questions about what exists have objective answers. The question whether possible worlds exist is factual, not merely a matter of choosing linguistic frameworks. This substantive realism about metaphysics motivated Lewis's entire philosophical program and methodology. Boundary cases reveal limitations in how far modal realism's explanatory scope extends successfully. Impossible worlds present difficulties because Lewis only posits possible worlds satisfying logical consistency. Yet semantic theories sometimes invoke impossible worlds to explain certain linguistic and cognitive phenomena. Intentional states can represent impossible situations, like someone believing contradictory propositions simultaneously. We reason about impossible scenarios when exploring reductio arguments or mathematical conjectures later refuted. Fiction contains impossible situations like time travel paradoxes that audiences understand despite their impossibility. These phenomena seem to require impossible worlds as representational resources beyond possible worlds. However, Lewis resisted extending his ontology to include impossible worlds for several reasons. First, it remains unclear what concrete impossible worlds would be or how they could exist. Can contradictions literally obtain in concrete physical reality anywhere at all? The notion seems incoherent rather than merely strange or counterintuitive. Second, impossible worlds might undermine the reduction of modality to quantification over worlds. If both possible and impossible worlds exist, we need independent criteria distinguishing them. These criteria will presumably be modal, reintroducing the primitive modality Lewis sought to eliminate. Third, many phenomena apparently requiring impossible worlds might be explained alternatively. Perhaps impossible representations are partial or fragmentary rather than describing complete consistent worlds. We might handle impossibility through incomplete or contradictory representations rather than impossible objects of representation. Vagueness presents another boundary case that modal realism handles with difficulty. Some predicates like bald or heap lack sharp boundaries between applying and failing to apply. A man with 10,000 hairs is clearly not bald, while one with 0 hairs clearly is bald. But no specific number n exists where n hairs means not bald, while n minus 1 hairs means bald. This vagueness seems to resist analysis in terms of worlds with precise properties and sharp boundaries. Lewis proposed treating vagueness as semantic indecision rather than metaphysical indeterminacy. Many precise interpretations of vague terms exist, and we have not fully decided among them. Each precisification corresponds to drawing boundaries at different places in the spectrum of cases. However, this semantic approach faces objections that vagueness sometimes seems genuinely metaphysical. Perhaps reality itself contains borderline cases that are neither determinately in nor determinately out. Higher-order vagueness compounds the problem by making even the boundaries of borderline cases vague. It is vague where the vague region begins and where it ends in the spectrum of cases. This suggests infinite hierarchies of vagueness that semantic indecision models struggle to accommodate satisfactorily. Hessetism concerns whether worlds can differ in which objects exist without differing in qualitative character. Two worlds are hexatistically distinct if they differ regarding which individual is which, despite identical qualities. One world contains Adam and Eve in a garden, while another contains Adam prime and Eve prime instead. These individuals are qualitatively indistinguishable but numerically distinct according to hoxetistic differences. Lewis initially opposed hoxetism, arguing that worlds should differ only if they differ qualitatively somehow. However, he later acknowledged that counterpart theory might accommodate haexietistic differences after all. Different counterpart relations could generate haexietistic distinctions even among qualitatively identical scenarios. This flexibility represents both a strength and potential weakness of counterpart theory's framework. It can accommodate more phenomena, but risks becoming too flexible to constrain modal claims adequately. Temporal modality raises questions about whether time is relevantly similar to modality for Lewis's purposes. Temporal operators like it will be the case, and it was the case, resemble modal operators formally. Perhaps times are to temporal operators what worlds are to modal operators in their semantic functioning. Lewis explored these parallels, but also noted important differences between temporal and modal dimensions. We have causal access to past times through memory traces and artifacts they leave behind. We have causal influence on future times through our present actions affecting later events. But other possible worlds are causally isolated from ours, both backward and forward temporally. This disanalogy might justify treating time and modality differently in fundamental metaphysics. Epistemology of modality remains contentious even among those sympathetic to modal realism's general framework. How we acquire modal knowledge and what justifies modal beliefs requires explanation beyond truth conditions. Lewis provided truth conditions for modal statements, but less detailed accounts of modal epistemology. He suggested that modal knowledge combines ordinary experience with a priori reasoning about recombination possibilities. But critics argue this explanation remains too sketchy to address serious epistemological challenges. We seem to know many specific modal facts, like water could have frozen at different temperatures. How does experience plus recombination principles deliver this specific knowledge about chemical possibilities? The epistemological gap between modal realism's metaphysics and its epistemology remains incompletely bridged. Part 10. Impact, Legacy and Common Misconceptions. David Lewis's modal realism transformed contemporary analytic metaphysics despite remaining a minority position. His work established metaphysics as a central and respectable area of philosophical inquiry. Before Lewis, many philosophers viewed metaphysics skeptically, following logical positivism's anti-metaphysical stance. Positivists claimed metaphysical statements lack cognitive content because they are empirically unverifiable. Lewis demonstrated that rigorous metaphysics could be practiced using precise formal methods and systematic argumentation. He showed how metaphysical theories connect to empirically respectable areas like semantics and scientific reasoning. This rehabilitation of metaphysics influenced an entire generation of philosophers who followed Lewis. Ted Sider, Kit Fine, Timothy Williamson, and David Chalmers all work in traditions Lewis helped establish. His methodology of systematic metaphysical theorizing became standard practice in contemporary philosophy. Philosophers now regularly construct comprehensive frameworks attempting to unify diverse phenomena under common principles. The technical apparatus Lewis developed spread far beyond those accepting his specific metaphysical conclusions. Counterpart theory is widely used even by philosophers rejecting Modal realism's concrete worlds. Philosophers recognized that counterpart semantics solves problems independent of Lewis's ontological commitments. One can use counterpart theory while treating worlds as abstract entities rather than concrete universes. Similarly, Lewis's work on causation influenced vast literature on causal analysis and causal inference. His counterfactual analysis of causation became the starting point for most subsequent theories. Even critics who reject counterfactual analyses address Lewis's framework and respond to his arguments. In philosophy of language, Lewis's contributions to intentional semantics proved enormously influential. His work on convention, context dependence, and semantic interpretation shaped how linguists approach meaning. Formal semanticists routinely use possible worlds frameworks inspired partly by Lewis's philosophical work. The notion of a context as a set of worlds satisfying certain constraints pervades contemporary semantic theory. Lewis's treatment of conditionals became standard in both linguistics and philosophical logic. The Stalnaker-Lewis Semantics for Counterfactuals is taught in graduate courses worldwide. His analysis of knowledge as an uneliminated possibility influenced mainstream epistemology significantly. Contextualist theories of knowledge ascriptions draw heavily on Lewis's pioneering work in this area. He showed how context determines which alternatives need elimination for knowledge attributions. This framework helped philosophers address skeptical arguments by analyzing their context-shifting strategies. In ethics, Lewis's work on decision theory and value theory contributed to consequentialist moral philosophy. His dispositional theory of value treats values as dispositions to value things under ideal conditions. This sophisticated form of ideal observer theory influenced metaethics and practical reasoning theory. Lewis's general philosophical style emphasized clarity, precision, and systematic interconnection among topics. He wrote with exceptional lucidity, making complex ideas accessible without sacrificing rigor or depth. His papers model philosophical argumentation at its best, with careful dialectic and thorough consideration of objections. Many philosophers cite Lewis's work as exemplifying the highest standards of analytic philosophy. A memorial poll conducted by Brian Leiter ranked Lewis fourth among major Anglophone philosophers between 1945 and 2000. Only Quine, Kripke, and Rawls ranked higher in this survey of professional philosophers' assessments. This recognition reflects Lewis's broad impact across multiple philosophical subdisciplines simultaneously. Few philosophers have contributed so fundamentally to so many different areas of inquiry. However, several common misconceptions about modal realism persist even among professional philosophers. The first misconception is that modal realism claims our world somehow creates or causes other worlds to exist. This misunderstands the view completely because all worlds exist independently without causal connections among them. Our world does not generate other worlds, and other worlds do not generate ours causally. They simply all exist as separate concrete regions of reality, isolated from one another. The second misconception is that modal realism posits duplicates of ourselves living alternative lives elsewhere. Lewis explicitly denied that I exist in other worlds because individuals are world-bound. Other worlds contain my counterparts, people similar to me, not me, myself, existing multiply. The distinction between identity and counterparthood is fundamental to Lewis's overall framework. The third misconception is that modal realism is purely speculative metaphysics without any pragmatic rationale. Lewis argued extensively that his theory solves genuine philosophical problems better than any alternative. The view deserves consideration for its explanatory benefits rather than merely its metaphysical boldness. The fourth misconception is that modal realism treats everything as possible without any constraints on possibility. Lewis distinguished logical possibility from various forms of metaphysical and natural impossibility carefully. Contradictions are impossible, and certain combinations violate metaphysical principles even if logically consistent. The fifth misconception is that modal realism is somehow scientifically disreputable or anti-naturalistic. Lewis explicitly defended naturalism and saw his metaphysics as continuous with scientific theorizing. He analogized possible worlds to theoretical entities in physics like quarks and curved spacetime. Both are initially counterintuitive but earn acceptance through explanatory indispensability. The sixth misconception is that accepting modal realism requires abandoning ordinary beliefs about what exists. Lewis insisted that modal realism adds to our ontology rather than subtracting from it. We still have tables, chairs, people, and planets as before, plus additional worlds beyond ours. The seventh misconception is that modal realism is compatible with any metaphysical view whatsoever. Lewis combined modal realism with specific commitments to Humean supervenience, materialism, and unrestricted composition. These commitments formed an integrated package rather than independent separable components. Rejecting human supervenience, for instance, would require significant modifications to Lewis's overall system. The eighth misconception is that Lewis believed modal realism with absolute certainty beyond reasonable doubt. He acknowledged that his theory conflicts with common sense and faces serious objections. Lewis defended modal realism as the best available theory, not as obviously or certainly true. He practiced fallibilism, remaining open to better alternatives if they emerged. The ninth misconception is that modal realism is primarily about defending an interesting metaphysical speculation. Lewis saw himself as solving real philosophical problems rather than indulging in metaphysical speculation. The problems concerning modality, causation, and properties motivated his theory rather than independent interest in exotic ontologies. The 10th misconception is that modal realism's influence derives mainly from its shocking ontological boldness. While the view's boldness attracted attention, its lasting influence comes from technical innovations and systematic argumentation. Philosophers engage Lewis's work because it advances understanding regardless of modal realism's ultimate truth. Looking forward, modal realism's legacy continues evolving as philosophers develop and criticize Lewis's framework. Contemporary metaphysicians explore refinements, alternatives, and applications, extending Lewis's foundational contributions. Some develop neo-Lewisian views, modifying specific commitments while preserving the general framework. Others use Lewis's work as a foil for developing competing theories, clarified through contrast with his views. The debate between modal realism and its competitors remains active, with no consensus emerging yet. This ongoing controversy testifies to the depth and significance of the issues Lewis raised. Philosophers continue finding new applications for possible worlds frameworks in emerging areas. Philosophy of mind uses possible worlds to analyze mental content, consciousness, and intentionality. Philosophy of physics applies modal concepts to quantum mechanics, space-time structure, and physical laws. Philosophy of biology employs modal notions in understanding natural selection, adaptation, and biological function. These applications demonstrate that modal concepts pervade philosophical thinking across all domains. Whether we ultimately accept Lewis's metaphysics, his conceptual frameworks prove indispensable tools. The possible worlds framework structures how contemporary philosophers think about modality, meaning, and metaphysics generally. Lewis's achievement lies partly in establishing this framework's centrality to philosophical inquiry. He showed that systematic use of possible worlds illuminates otherwise intractable philosophical problems. This methodological lesson persists regardless of ongoing metaphysical disagreements about worlds' nature. Modal realism exemplifies philosophy's capacity for bold, systematic theorizing in the grand tradition. It demonstrates how philosophical imagination, combined with rigorous argumentation, can generate transformative insights. Lewis's work reminds us that philosophy sometimes requires courage to pursue counterintuitive conclusions systematically. We should not let initial incredulity prevent serious consideration of theories with genuine explanatory power. At the same time, modal realism illustrates philosophy's proper humility about even our best theories. No matter how systematic and comprehensive a theory becomes, it remains subject to rational criticism and potential refutation. Lewis practiced philosophy as an ongoing conversation where ideas face rigorous testing and refinement. He contributed arguments rather than dogmas, inviting engagement rather than demanding acceptance. This spirit of open inquiry combined with systematic ambition defines philosophy at its finest. Modal realism stands as a monument to what philosophical creativity and rigor can accomplish. Whether true or false, it has permanently enriched philosophical understanding of modality, possibility, and reality's fundamental structure. Lewis's work will continue inspiring and challenging philosophers for generations to come. The questions he raised about what exists, what is possible, and how we know remain central to metaphysics. His answers may be revised or rejected, but the questions themselves prove enduring and fundamental. Modal realism thus represents a defining achievement in 20th century analytic philosophy. It synthesized technical logic, systematic metaphysics, and naturalistic methodology into a comprehensive philosophical vision. Few theories in philosophy's history have combined such technical sophistication with such metaphysical audacity. Lewis showed us how far systematic philosophical theorizing can take us when pursued with rigor and imagination. His legacy ensures that modal realism will remain a touchstone for metaphysical inquiry indefinitely. The plurality of worlds, whether real or merely conceptual, has become indispensable to philosophical thought.